The bell rang before the sun broke the horizon. Its hollow clang carried across the fields, through the woods, and into the cramped slave quarters that lined the far edge of the plantation. It was not a church bell, nor a call to prayer. It was a chain's echo, a command to rise, no matter how heavy the body, no matter how broken the spirit. Inside one of the shacks, the air was thick with the stench of damp straw and unwashed clothes. Samuel stirred awake, the stiffness in his back screaming louder than the bell. His shoulders bore old scars, raised welts, like ridges carved into him by years of the overseer's lash. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake Isaiah, the young boy curled up beside him. Isaiah's ribs showed through his thin skin, rising and falling with each shallow breath. Up now, a voice whispered from the dark. It was Ruth, Isaiah's mother, her eyes tired, her body frail. She had been up long before the bell, folding scraps of cloth, preparing for another day in the fields. Samuel gave her a faint nod. Outside, men and women dragged themselves from the huts, forming a line as the overseer's shadow appeared in the mist.
"Hey, Mr. Harlan."
His whip coiled at his side, surveyed the bodies with cold eyes. "Move, cattle," he barked. "Sun ain't up, but you will be." His boots crunched on the dirt as he passed, and every slave straightened. Terrified of drawing his attention, Samuel was marched not to the fields, but to the forge. It was his lot to work the iron shoe, the master's horses, mend chains, hammer nails, sharpen blades. He was too valuable for the cotton rows, or so the master often said with a smirk, as though Samuel were a prized tool, not a man. But before the day's labor began, Samuel's eyes lingered on Clara. She stood near the big house, her head lowered, a basket in her arms. The mistress had already called her in, demanding biscuits, coffee, roasted pork. Clara never ate the meals she cooked. She survived on scraps, her stomach gnawing at her bones, while her hands prepared feasts for others. Samuel caught her glance for the briefest moment, two pairs of weary eyes finding each other in the gray dawn. Inside the kitchen, Clara moved like a shadow among the pots. The mistress, dressed in silks even before breakfast, scolded her. "Too slow, girl. The guests will be here tonight, and you'll not shame me." Clara swallowed her words, biting her lip until she tasted blood. She stirred the pot, the smell of spiced ham rising, her own belly hollow. At the forge, Samuel's hammer struck iron. Sparks leapt into the dim air, burning his arms. The heat choked him, sweat running down his chest as he hammered link after link of chain. He knew what they were for. He had seen them bite into ankles, cutting flesh until blood pooled in the dirt. Each strike of the hammer was an insult to his soul, but refusal meant the whip. By midday, the sun glared down cruelly. The field hands staggered with baskets of cotton, their fingers bleeding, overseers shouting at them to move faster. From the kitchen windows, Clara could see them collapse, sometimes trampled as the overseer's horses charged forward to scare them back into line. She wanted to scream, but her voice was buried beneath years of silence. That night, when the bell tolled again, the slaves dragged themselves back to their quarters. Samuel sat by the faint fire, Isaiah resting against him. Clara came quietly from the kitchen, her hands trembling as she slipped a small hunk of cornbread from her apron. She passed it to Ruth, who broke it into 3 pieces and gave Samuel the smallest share. It tasted like ash in his mouth, not because of the bread itself, but because of the cruelty of its cost. "We'll make it through another day," Ruth whispered. Though her eyes did not believe her own words, Samuel looked into the fire. His face was hard, but his chest burned with something unspoken. He had no words for it yet. It was not hope. Hope was dangerous, poisonous, easily crushed beneath a whip. It was something heavier, deeper, a quiet defiance, waiting for its time. The night grew still. Whip cracks echoed faintly in Samuel's memory, carrying across the fields like ghosts. He closed his eyes, but there was no peace in sleep-only chains, ringing at dawn. Asterisk, the forge was a prison of flame. Long before the first rays of sunlight touched the Virginia soil, Samuel was already inside, striking iron on the anvil, sweat rolling down his back in dark rivers. The sound of hammer against steel rang through the air like a drumbeat of captivity. Each strike built the master's wealth. Each strike fashioned a tool Samuel would never own. A chain he wished he could shatter instead of shape. The heat was suffocating. The air smelled of burning coal and hot metal, mixed with the salt of his sweat. Sparks leapt into his arms and chest, leaving tiny burns he could not pause to soothe. He gritted his teeth, focusing on the rhythm. Lift, strike, turn, strike again. The overseer's boots paced the dirt outside, ensuring his rhythm never faltered. "Keep that hammer moving, boy." Harlan's voice cut through the heat. "We've horses to shoe before sundown, and I'll have no excuses." Samuel did not answer. He bent over the iron, shaping a horseshoe. His muscles ached, his palms blistered from the handle. He could still feel yesterday's welts along his back, but silence was his only shield. Words would only invite the lash dot by mid-morning. The forge smelled not just of iron, but of fear. Another slave, Henry, stumbled in carrying a wagon wheel for repair. Henry was small, his shoulders bent from years of picking cotton. His hands trembled as he set the wheel on the ground. "You drop it again, and I'll beat the black hide off you," Harlan barked. Henry froze, eyes wide, then turned to Samuel as though seeking protection. But Samuel kept his eyes down. To meet the overseer's gaze was to invite disaster. When Harlan left, Samuel whispered to Henry, his voice low as the hammer's hum, "Breathe slow. Keep steady. Don't give him reason." Henry nodded, swallowing hard, his lips cracked from thirst. Samuel handed him a small ladle of water from the forge bucket. Their eyes met, briefly gratitude and shame mingling, while Samuel labored under the overseer's eye. Clara was trapped in another furnace. The kitchen fire blazed hot as she stirred pots of stew, roasted pork, and baked pies. The mistress's voice rang sharp behind her, demanding perfection. "You think I'll serve half-done bread to my guests? Do it again, girl." A wooden spoon cracked across Clara's knuckles, leaving red welts. She clenched her teeth, forcing herself not to cry out. She kneaded the dough again, though her stomach roared with hunger. She hadn't eaten since dawn, just a sip of thin broth and a crust of bread. Yet she prepared meals rich with butter cream and spiced meats she would never taste. A house servant beside her whispered, "Hold steady. Don't let her see your tears." Clara bit down hard on her lip, nodding. By noon, Samuel's arms shook from exhaustion. The master himself strode into the forge, a tall man with a polished cane and smug smile. His coat was trimmed in velvet. His boots freshly shined shoes Samuel had nailed and polished himself. "Fine work." "Samuel," the master said, circling him like a hawk. "Strong hands, steady arms. You're worth every dollar I paid. Don't forget you belong to me. That hammer," he tapped it with his cane, "isn't yours. These chains," he lifted a freshly forged set, "iron still hot, belong to me. Even the sweat rolling off your back belongs to me. Don't forget it." Samuel kept his eyes down. The master's words burned more than the forge's heat. To know that his labor not only built wealth but chained his own people, it hollowed him out. Yet he forced his face still, his rage buried deep beneath silence. Later, Clara carried trays of steaming dishes into the dining hall. Rich white men in fine coats laughed around the table, gambling cards and slamming glasses of whiskey. They did not glance at her except when her dress brushed against their chairs. "Careful there," Gal One drawled, pinching her arm as she passed. "Spill on me, and I'll have your hide." Her hand shook, but she managed not to spill. She bowed her head, setting down the platter. The men's laughter roared, filling the hall with arrogance. Clara slipped out quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. That night. Back in the quarters, Samuel sat by the dying fire, his body numb from the day. Clara arrived late, her eyes red, her hands still trembling. She sat beside him, close but not touching. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken grief. Finally, Clara whispered, "They feast while we starve. They wear silk while we wear rags. How long, Samuel? How long can this last?" Samuel's jaw tightened. He stared into the flames. "As long as they have the whip? As long as we have these chains?" Her hand brushed against his, trembling but strong. One day she whispered, almost to herself, One day something will break. Samuel said nothing, but in his chest the words struck deep. Each hammer's strike, each flame's heat, each cruel laugh of the master, it all pressed into him, shaping something harder than iron, not hope. Not yet, but a seed of defiance, buried in fire and iron, waiting for its time to rise. And iron, waiting for its time to rise. The whip cracked before the sun fully rose. It wasn't punishment this time, not yet. It was warning. Mr. Harlan liked to let its sound travel through the morning mist, slicing across the fields like thunder. It reminded every man, woman, and child of what awaited should they falter. Samuel stood outside the forge, his arms already stiff from yesterday's labor, listening to the crack of leather on air. Each sound tightened his chest. He knew before the day ended someone would feel it. Down by the cotton rows, the slaves bent low over the plants, their fingers moving quick, plucking white tufts from prickling burrs until their skin tore. Overseers rode on horseback between the rows, their shadows long and sharp in the morning light. They shouted, cursed, and lashed their whips across bent backs. To fall behind was to bleed. Harlan, tall and broad-shouldered, relished his role. His whip was more than a tool. It was his crown. He wielded it with flourish, snapping it at the dirt when a child slowed, curling it around a man's ankle just to watch him stumble. His voice carried like poison across the fields. You move when I say move. You eat when I say eat. You ain't people, you're stock. And stock don't talk back. Samuel hammered iron in the forge, but his ears caught every word. His hammer struck harder, faster, with each crack of the whip. Sweat dripped from his brow, sizzling on the hot metal. He forced himself to focus, though his knuckles whitened around the hammer's handle. The first punishment came before noon. Isaiah, the boy Samuel often watched over, had been caught with half a biscuit in his hand. He had stolen it from the kitchen scraps. Samuel's stomach twisted as he saw the overseers drag the boy into the yard, his cries sharp and frantic. Please, sir. Please, I was hungry. Isaiah wailed, his small body shaking. Harlan sneered, twirling the whip in the air. Hungry. You'll learn hunger don't give you rights. The whip came down. Once, twice, a third time. The sound tore through the air, followed by the boy's scream. Blood splattered the dirt. Ruth, his mother, fell to her knees, begging for mercy, her hands clutching the hem of Harlan's boot. Please, sir. He's just a child. Harlan shoved her down, his boot grinding into her hand. And he'll learn like a man, or he won't live to be one. Samuel froze in the forge doorway, his chest heaving. Every muscle screamed at him to move, to strike, to stop the lash. But he did not move. He could not. His mind filled with the sight of chains, with the memory of men hanged from trees for raising a hand. He knew one moment of defiance could mean death for all of them. So he stood in silence, hammer trembling in his fist, watching Isaiah bleed into the dust. The punishment dragged on until the boy collapsed unconscious. Finally, Harlan barked for 2 men to carry him back to the quarters. His back was torn raw, his cries now only whispers. Ruth followed, weeping so hard she could barely walk. That evening, Clara carried supper into the master's dining hall. The mistress laughed about the day's entertainment, speaking of Isaiah's whipping as though it were a tale to share over wine. The boy will remember his place now, she said, sipping from her glass. One of the guests chuckled, murmuring they're like dogs. You've got to beat 'em if you want 'em trained. Clara's hands shook as she poured whiskey into a guest's cup. Her knuckles whitened against the bottle, her jaw tight. She could not speak. To speak would mean pain. To show anger would mean worse. She set the bottle down and slipped out quietly, her throat tight with rage. Later, in the quarters, the slaves gathered in the shadows. Isaiah lay on a straw pallet, moaning softly, his back a maze of torn flesh. Ruth sat beside him, rocking back and forth, her voice hoarse from crying. God above, she whispered, why you let them do this to us? No one answered. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Samuel sat apart, staring at his scarred hands. He felt the fire of the forge still in his chest, a heat he could not cool. Clara sat beside him, her eyes red from tears she dared not shed in the big house. "You saw?" she whispered. "You heard. Every day it's the same, and we stay silent." Samuel clenched his fists, the hammer's weight still in his mind. "Silence keeps us alive," he muttered. "Alive for what?" Clara's voice trembled. "To be whipped? To watch children bleed? To cook their feasts while we starve?" Her words cut like blades. Samuel's breath caught. He wanted to tell her she was right. He wanted to say the silence was killing him too. But his voice stuck, trapped by fear as heavy as iron chains. Across the room, someone began to hum a low, mournful tune. It rose slowly, spreading among the weary voices, a song carried from Africa, carried through generations. The melody was soft, fragile, yet it reached into the darkness like a trembling flame. Samuel closed his eyes, listening. The whip's crack still echoed in his memory, but the song dulled its edge. For a moment, he felt the ember of something deeper than fear. It was not freedom, not yet, but it was defiance. A small, trembling defiance that survived even the overseer's whip. Asterisk night came slow on the plantation, as if the sun itself dreaded leaving the slaves to darkness. The day's sweat still clung to their backs when they stumbled into the quarters. The smell of damp wood and smoke filled the cramped huts, the silence broken by moans of pain and the soft whimpering of children. Samuel sat near the low fire, his hammer-calloused hands resting on his knees. The forge still burned in his muscles, each heartbeat a throb of exhaustion. His mind replayed the sound of Isaiah's cries from earlier, the crack of Harlan's whip tearing through the air. He could not forget it. Clara slipped into the quarters long after the others. Her apron was empty now, the food she cooked devoured by the master's guests. Their laughter still echoing faintly across the fields. But her eyes flicked toward Samuel, then toward Ruth and the injured boy on his straw bed. She moved close, her fingers twitching nervously. When she sat down beside Ruth, she opened her hand. Nestled in her palm was a small hunk of cornbread, stolen from the kitchen. Ruth's eyes widened. Her lips trembled. "Child, you'll get yourself killed." Clara shook her head quickly. "He needs it. Just a little will help him." Ruth broke the bread into tiny pieces and pressed one against Isaiah's lips. His eyes fluttered open. Weakly he chewed, his face twisting with pain but his body clinging to the nourishment. Samuel watched, his chest tight, as the boy swallowed. Clara handed the rest to Ruth and whispered, "Share it." Quiet. Around the fire, the others pretended not to see, though their eyes burned with hunger. They hummed soft songs, their voices weaving together to cover the act of defiance. One of the older men tapped his foot, starting a rhythm. Another joined in, clapping lightly. Soon the quarters pulsed with a hidden heartbeat music, low and dangerous, a language of survival. Samuel found himself humming too, his deep voice blending with the others. For a moment the air felt different. Not free, ever free but alive. The moment did not last. The next day whispers reached the master's ears. A kitchen boy had seen Clara slip food into her apron. The boy, desperate for favor, told Harlan, and Harlan, eager to prove his worth, wasted no time by sundown. The master himself strode into the quarters, cane tapping the dirt. His face was flushed from drink, his lips curled in a cruel smile. "I hear my slaves think they can steal from me. Take my food to feed themselves like they're more than beasts." He paused, eyeing the faces turned toward the floor. Who dares? No one spoke. Silence stretched thick, broken only by the sound of Ruth's ragged breathing as she clutched Isaiah close. Harlan stepped forward, whip coiled in his hand. "They'll talk when they bleed." 3 men were seized at random, dragged into the yard. They protested, swore they had taken nothing, but their voices were drowned by the overseer's barked orders. The rest of the slaves were forced to gather, to watch. "Punishment teaches better when it's shared," the master declared. His cane tapped against his boot. "All of you will see what happens when gratitude turns to theft." Samuel stood in the crowd, fists clenched, jaw grinding. Clara was beside him, her face pale, her body shaking. He could see the truth burning in her eyes that this was her doing, her bread, her choice. But she could not speak. To confess would mean worse than death. Harlan cracked the whip. The first man fell with a scream, his back opening under the lash. Blood darkened his shirt. The second staggered, bit his lip until it bled. But still he cried out when the leather struck again and again. The third collapsed after only a few blows, his body twitching in the dirt. Children screamed. Women sobbed. The men clenched their teeth, standing rigid, powerless. Samuel's heart pounded so hard he thought it would break his ribs. He wanted to move, to tear the whip from Harlan's hand, to strike back. But the hammer was far away, and the guns of the overseers gleamed in the torchlight. He forced himself still. The only sound he made was the grinding of his teeth. When it was done, the three men lay groaning in the dirt, their backs raw and bleeding. Harlan wiped the sweat from his brow, smirking. The master waved his cane and said, "Let that be lesson enough. My property eats when I say so. Not before. Not after." The crowd dispersed, silent as ghosts. Later that night, Samuel sat by the faint embers of the fire, his face shadowed and grim. Clara sat across from him, her eyes hollow. "It was me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "My bread. My fault." Samuel's gaze lifted, heavy and hard. For a moment he said nothing. Then quietly he answered, "It was mercy. And mercy is punished here. It was mercy. And mercy is punished here." Clara's lip trembled. "I can't stop. If I stop, what's left of us? What are we then?" Samuel's eyes fixed on the flames, his hands flexed, scarred and strong. He thought of the forge, of the chains he made, of the hammer's weight. He thought of Isaiah's cries, of the men writhing under the lash dot. Finally, he whispered, "One day something will break. Not just bread, not just bodies. Something more." The fire popped, sparks leaping into the dark. In that silence, the words hung heavy, dangerous, but alive. Asterisk, asterisk. The plantations stirred with unnatural energy that week. Wagons creaked down the dusty road, bringing guests from neighboring estates. The master wanted to impress, and that meant food, drink, horses, and the kind of entertainment that left blood on the ground. Samuel was forced to labor night and day in the forge. The sound of hammer on iron never stopped. Horseshoes had to be made, wagon wheels mended, blades sharpened. Sweat poured down his body in sheets, his hands blistering over old scars. The overseers prowled like vultures, reminding him at every turn, "Faster, blacksmith. The master's guests won't wait." Every strike of the hammer reminded Samuel of the chains he'd forged, chains he'd seen clamp onto ankles, clink as men and women were dragged to the block. He bent over the anvil, shaping cold iron into tools of wealth and cruelty, feeling rage burn hotter than the coals. Clara, too, worked without rest. The kitchen was a furnace of heat and noise. She roasted chickens and pigs over open flame, boiled stews in heavy iron pots, baked bread and pies until her arms shook from exhaustion. The mistress hovered nearby, her voice sharp as a knife. "Not enough spice. Too much salt. You'll ruin everything if you don't do it right, girl." Clara kept her eyes down, her lips pressed shut. She had learned long ago that backtalk brought punishment. She stirred, chopped, and carried on in silence, though her stomach growled from hunger. The food she made was meant for men in silk coats and polished boots. While she survived on scraps, by evening, the big house was full of noise. The dining room glowed with candlelight, the air thick with the smell of tobacco and whiskey. Men crowded around tables covered in cards and dice, their laughter booming. Silver coins clinked against the wood, but they weren't the only wagers in the corner. Samuel watched as he was ordered to stand ready for work. He was not allowed to sit. He polished a blade slowly, but his ears caught every word. One planter leaned back, smirking. "I'll raise your wager $10 and that boy you just bought last month. The one strong enough to carry 2 sacks of cotton." The table roared with laughter. Another slapped his knee. $10 and a slave? That's a man's bet. The master chuckled, tapping his cane on the floor. Done. But don't cry when you lose. Stock don't come cheap these days. The game went on. Dice rolled, cards slapped, coins and lives traded in the span of heartbeats. Samuel's jaw tightened until it ached. He knew the boy they spoke of, a child not older than 12, who sang softly to himself at night to keep the fear away. Further down the table, another guest smirked. I'll wager my mare against one of your wenches. That one I saw in the kitchen, she's a pretty piece. Clara's heart froze when she heard the laughter that followed. She kept her hand steady on the tray she carried, but inside her chest, terror clawed at her ribs. She knew what pretty meant in a room full of drunken men. The mistress waved a dismissive hand, laughing along with them. That girl's worth more in the kitchen than in your bed, though I suppose she'd serve either way. Laughter roared again. Clara set the tray down with trembling hands and slipped out quickly, her face pale. She could still hear the words behind her, their voices loud and careless. Later that night, Samuel returned to the quarters. His body heavy from work but his mind alive with fury. Clara sat near the fire, staring into the flames, her eyes glassy. They talk about us like we're dice, she whispered. Like we're horses. Samuel lowered himself beside her, his hands still stained with soot and iron. He didn't answer at first. His chest was tight, his throat thick with words he could not form. Finally, he said, "We are flesh to them. Flesh and iron. That's all they see." Clara turned, her voice breaking. "What are we to ourselves, Samuel? If they strip everything, what do we have left?" Samuel stared into the flames, seeing not wood and fire, but the forge's hammer striking. Sparks flying, chains forming link by link. He thought of Isaiah's torn back, Ruth's hollow eyes, Clara's trembling hands. He thought of the laughter around the table as a child was wagered like a coin. "We have what they fear," he said at last, his voice low, steady. "We have each other. And we have the fire they can't kill?" "Not yet." Clara studied his face, the set of his jaw, the hardness in his eyes. She nodded slowly. "Fire can forge chains, but it can also break them." The words lingered between them, heavy, dangerous. Neither spoke again. The fire crackled softly, the night pressing in. But inside Samuel's chest, a spark caught flame. One that no whip, no card game, no master's laugh could extinguish. Asterisk morning broke with no mercy. A cold wind swept across the fields, carrying the scent of damp earth and manure. The overseer's whistle shrieked before the sun even climbed over the trees. Men and women stumbled from the quarters, their bodies stiff, their eyes heavy. Samuel rose slowly, his muscles screaming from the forge's endless demands. His palms were a web of cracked blisters, his shoulders raw from strain. Clara tied a rag around her hair and adjusted the threadbare dress the mistress allowed her. The cloth was patched so many times, it looked like a quilt of suffering. The day began like every other labor without end. Overseers with whips at the ready, no room for mistakes. Samuel hammered iron until his ears rang. Clara cooked until her arms shook, carrying trays heavier than her thin frame could bear. But beneath the routine, something had shifted. The night of the gambling still burned in their minds. The laughter of the masters, the image of children and women wagered like coins, it lingered. Sour and poisonous at the forge, Isaiah approached Samuel quietly during a rare moment when the overseer turned his back. His shirt still bore dark stains from his last beating. His eyes were bloodshot, but his voice carried a steady rhythm. "You saw it, didn't you?" Isaiah whispered. "Saw them throw us round like cards on a table." Samuel nodded, his jaw tightening. Isaiah's lips curled in something between a smile and a snarl. "Every chain you make could break as easy as it's forged. That hammer of yours don't only build, it can destroy." Samuel said nothing, but his grip on the hammer tightened. He thought of the glowing iron, the sparks that leapt like fireflies when struck. Isaiah's words planted themselves like seeds in his chest. Meanwhile, Clara found herself cornered in the kitchen by the mistress, who shoved a tray into her hands. "Move faster, girl. Guests will be here any day. You don't want them thinking we keep lazy stock." Clara's arms trembled, but she carried the tray without a word. When she stepped into the pantry, she nearly collided with Ruth, the older woman whose daughter had been sold. Ruth caught her by the arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "They'll keep feeding on us till nothing's left," Ruth murmured. "But a flame can burn the hand that strikes it." Clara met her gaze. Ruth's eyes were sunken, her face lined, but her voice carried a weight of truth. "I don't want to die here, Clara," Ruth whispered, "and neither should you." That night, the quarters hummed with tired silence. A few whispered prayers, a few soft sobs, but beneath it all, a tension growing like storm clouds. Samuel sat by the fire, hammer across his lap, turning it slowly in his hands. Clara sat beside him, silent, until the others drifted into uneasy sleep. Finally, she spoke. "Isaiah said something to me. Ruth, too. They both talk about fire, about breaking." Samuel's jaw clenched. "Breaking brings the whip, brings death, and living like this isn't death already?" Clara's voice cracked, but her eyes burned. "They sell us, use us, trade us like dice. Children disappear. Women?" She cut herself off, shaking. "I won't let them take me that way, Samuel. I'd rather burn." The hammer felt heavy in his hands. He thought of the forge iron bent beneath his will, reshaped by fire and force. He thought of the overseer's lash biting into Isaiah's back, of Ruth's broken voice, of Clara trembling in the pantry. "They think we're too beaten to rise," Samuel said slowly. "They think they've ground us down so deep we've forgotten who we are." His eyes lifted to Clara's, but they don't see the fire. They never do. A silence fell, thick and dangerous. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. The firelight flickered across their faces. Throwing long shadows on the dirt floor, Clara leaned closer, her voice barely a breath. "If you strike, Samuel, I'll stand with you. Even if it kills us?" The weight of her words pressed on him like the anvil itself. He saw the future in flashes. Blood on soil, chains shattered, bodies broken. The chance of freedom, more the certainty of death. He closed his eyes, listening to the hammer's echo in his mind, the rhythm of iron on iron. When he opened them, the decision was not yet made, but the path had appeared. "We wait," he said at last, his voice low. "We watch. When the time comes, we strike not just with fire, but with fury they can't put back in chains." Clara nodded, her hand brushing his, trembling but resolute. The spark had been lit. It was small, fragile, hidden beneath fear and exhaustion, but it was there, alive and in the darkness of the quarters. Among the weary and broken, a spark was all it took to start a fire. A spark was all it took to start a fire. The days after that night carried a strange heaviness, like the air before a storm. Overseers shouted as always, whips cracked, and the master's voice boomed through the house. But underneath it all, something simmered. The slaves moved with quiet purpose, their eyes sharper, their silence heavier. Samuel worked the forge, shaping iron into horseshoes and chains, but now he lingered a little longer over certain pieces. A blade here, a sharpened rod, they're scraps of iron that could be bent into something more than farm tools. He hid them. In the ash pit beneath the forge, each piece a silent promise. Isaiah, his back still scarred, whispered to the men in the fields as they bent over cotton. "The blacksmith is with us," he said, "and where iron bends, so will chains." Word spread like smoke, carried from row to row. Not all listened. Not all dared, but enough. Let the thought settle in their bones. Clara kept her silence in the kitchen, her face a mask of obedience. But when Ruth passed by, their eyes met. In that brief glance, more was said than words could hold. Ruth nodded once small, sharp, a sign of readiness. The overseers, blind in their cruelty, did not notice. They saw only the same tired faces, the same bent backs. They mistook silence for submission. The night chosen came when the moon was thin and clouds swallowed the stars. The quarters lay in uneasy stillness. Children slept, women whispered prayers, men sharpened their breaths as much as their courage. Samuel sat by the fire with Clara, Isaiah, and Ruth. Before them lay the tools Samuel had hidden, a hammer, an iron rod. a length of chain twisted into a crude flail. Clara's hands trembled as she held a kitchen knife, its edge worn but sharp enough. "Once we begin," she whispered, "there's no turning back." Samuel looked at each of them, his voice low and steady. "They treat us as flesh and iron. Tonight we show them iron bleeds." The plan was simple but desperate. Isaiah would lead a small group to cut the horses loose, creating chaos. Samuel and 2 others would strike at the overseer's quarters. First, if the men with whips fell, the rest might follow. Clara and Ruth would guard the children, ready to run if the chance came. When the signal came, whistle soft as a bird call, the night erupted. Isaiah and his men moved quickly, slicing reins, slapping horses into frenzy. Hooves thundered, whinnies split the dark. Overseers stumbled awake to the noise, only to find Samuel's hammer crashing down on the first skull that appeared in the doorway. The sound was sickening, final. Another overseer reached for his rifle, but a chain whipped around his throat, pulling him to the dirt. Samuel's arms shook with the effort, rage burning through exhaustion. For a moment, freedom felt like fire in his veins. Clara clutched the knife, listening to the chaos from the quarters. She gathered children close, whispering for silence, though her own heart thundered louder than any hoofbeat. Ruth stood at the door, eyes fierce, ready to strike if any white man entered. The noise drew the master from his house, fury in his voice. "My stock, my slaves, bring them back." His cane tapped the porch as he bellowed orders. From the shadows, Samuel saw him, a tall figure silhouetted by lamplight, drunk on rage and power. For one breath, Samuel wanted nothing more than to drive the hammer into his skull, but rifles cracked from the veranda. Bullets tore through the night. Isaiah fell first, chest bursting crimson, his body dropping like a sack. The horses scattered, screams rising from the slaves who had dared to follow. The overseers rallied, their numbers greater, their weapons louder. Samuel fought like a man possessed, swinging hammer and chain, but iron could not hold against powder and shot. The rebellion faltered as quickly as it had flared. Clara saw it. From the quarters, the bodies in the dirt, the overseers regaining ground, the master's laughter ringing cruel. She grabbed Ruth's arm. "We have to run." But Ruth shook her head. Her daughter was gone, sold to strangers, and she would not flee. She rushed into the chaos, knife in hand, vanishing into the smoke and shouts. Samuel staggered, blood dripping from his arm where a bullet grazed him. He met Clara's eyes across the yard. For one breath, the world was silent. They saw everything, the life stolen from them, the fire they had tried to spark, the price they would pay. "Run," Samuel roared, his voice breaking. Clara hesitated, tears spilling, but another rifle cracked. Samuel's body jerked, the hammer slipping from his grip. He collapsed into the mud. The spark of fire extinguished beneath boots and gunpowder smoke. Clara's scream tore the night, raw and wild. She fled into the fields, clutching the knife, still slick in her hand, heart pounding like hooves in her chest. Behind her, the quarters burned, overseers shouting, the master's voice ringing triumphant. The rebellion had failed. The price had been paid in blood. But as Clara vanished into the dark woods, her breath ragged, her soul shattered, one truth remained. The fire had been lit. And even if stamped out here, it would burn again, carried by those who remembered the blood in the dirt, the hammer in the dark, the cry of a people who refused to be only flesh and iron. Asterisk, asterisk, the woods swallowed Clara whole, ran until her lungs, burned until the branches tore at her skin and her feet bled through the thin soles of her shoes. Behind her, the plantation blazed like a funeral pyre, its glow lighting the night sky. The sound of rifles faded, replaced by the chorus of crickets and the rush of her own pulse. She collapsed at last against a fallen tree, her chest heaving. Samuel's face haunted her every breath, the way he'd stood. Hammer raised, the way his voice had torn through the night as he shouted for her to run. She pressed her hand to her mouth to choke back a sob, but it escaped anyway, raw and hollow. Dawn came gray and cold. Clara rose, trembling, and stumbled deeper into the woods. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but she had no food. Her dress clung damp to her skin, her knife the only thing she carried. Every sound, every crack of a twig, Every rustle of leaf sent her heart racing. If hounds were loosed, she would not last long. By midday she found a stream, drank greedily, the water bitter but life-giving. Her reflection rippled in the current, eyes red, face smeared with dirt and ash, hair tangled. She barely recognized herself. She thought of Ruth, Isaiah, Samuel, all gone. She was the last ember of a fire smothered in blood. That night she stumbled into a clearing where an old man gathered wood. He froze when he saw her. His skin was dark, his clothes ragged, his eyes wary. Slowly he raised his hands, showing he carried no weapon. "You one of 'em runnin'?" he asked in a whisper. Clara could only nod, too weak to speak. The man looked around, then motioned her forward. "Come, before the dogs catch your scent." He led her to a small hut tucked deep in the trees, hidden by vines and brush. Inside, 2 women sat by a dim fire, their faces etched with the same weariness she carried. They gave her a blanket, a scrap of bread. Clara ate in silence, tears spilling with every bite. The old man spoke softly. "This place ain't freedom, just a stop on the road. Some run north, some hide deep, but every path is marked with blood." Clara clutched the blanket, her eyes hollow. "They killed him," she whispered, "fought for us. And they killed him." The women bowed their heads. One reached out, placing a hand on Clara's knee. "He lit a fire," she said, "and fire spreads, even if the wind takes one flame." For 3 nights Clara stayed hidden, her body slowly regaining strength. But on the 4th dawn, the sound of barking cut through the trees. The old man's face went pale. Hounds, they're close. She clutched the knife, her only weapon, as panic surged. The women urged her to run deeper into the woods, but Clara shook her head. "She was done running. They'll find me. They'll always find us," she said, voice raw. "But they won't take me back." The barking grew louder. Men's voices echoed through the trees. The women fled, dragging the old man with them. Clara stayed standing in the clearing, her knife in hand, her body trembling but unyielding. Moments later, the hounds burst through the brush, snarling, teeth bared. Behind them came 2 overseers on horseback, rifles glinting. "There she is," one shouted. The wench who slipped through. Clara raised the knife. Her arms shook, her knees weak, but her eyes blazed. "You'll not chain me," she whispered, though they could not hear her. The hounds lunged. She slashed once, the blade grazing fur. A rifle cracked. The pain tore through her side, fire burning in her ribs. She fell to her knees, blood soaking her dress. The overseers rode closer, grinning at her defiance. Should have known the cook had some bite, one sneered. He raised his rifle again. Clara lifted her head, meeting his eyes. For that one moment, she was not a slave, not flesh to be wagered, not iron to be broken. She was fire, small, flickering. But unyielding, she whispered Samuel's name as the shot rang out. Her body fell still in the clearing. The knife slipped from her hand, sinking into the earth. The overseers dragged her back to the plantation. What remained of her body thrown with the others who had dared to rise. The master made a show of it, declaring to his neighbors that rebellion would always be crushed. That slaves who forgot their place would meet only death, but in the quarters. In the hush of night her name was spoken in whispers. Ruth surviving. Kin told of the cook who defied, the blacksmith who struck, the men and women who chose fire over chains. Years later, long after the war had come and gone, some remembered. Old stories told in hidden places spoke of Samuel's hammer, of Clara's knife, of Isaiah's roar. They were gone, but their fire lingered, the last ember refusing to die, carried forward in memory, in blood, in every soul that would not bow.